Hi, today's video is going to be about cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is all about why all living organisms need to eat food. And it's basically how organisms transform food into energy. So this process is how all living organisms can transform food into energy. And so for cellular respiration, normally in classes, we teach it using glucose as the food source. Okay. And so most of the food that you eat will be digested and broken down, and most of it will be glucose. So it is like the main source of food that your body uses for energy. But your body can break down other things such as lipids and proteins. But we're just going to focus on one process because it is complex, and it would take, and you could take a whole class probably on just cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the title of our notes. And before I go into the weeds with you on this, I want to write the chemical equation. And the chemical equation for cellular respiration for the overall is that we have to have glucose. And glucose is C6H12O6. Okay, so that's glucose, and I'm going to write that here. Glucose. Plus, you have to have oxygen. Okay, and so just to balance out our equation, we're going to say 6 oxygens. And so this is why you breathe. And this is why all living organisms need oxygen. So you need glucose and you need oxygen, and then it goes through all these steps to end up with 6 water molecules. So you actually produce some water, and you're going to have 6 carbon dioxides. So when you exhale, you're exhaling the carbon dioxide, and you're going to make ATP. And we are going to say 36 to 38, depending on the situation. ATP. And ATP is the energy source that we are going to use to do all our living processes. Okay, so that's really the money, is the ATP. Okay, so that's the overall formula. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down cellular respiration into 3 steps. Okay, so there are 3 steps. And the names of the steps are, the first step is called, I'm going to say step 1 is called glycolysis. Okay, and I'll go into the details in a second. Step 2 is called the Krebs cycle. And step 3 is called the electron transport chain. Okay, and so those are the 3 steps. And I'm going to go into some detail about these 3 steps. But before I do that, I want to point out the mitochondria. So this is where this happens. Okay, and so this is a mitochondria in a eukaryotic cell. If it is a prokaryotic cell, prokaryotes don't have mitochondria. So cellular respiration happens in the outer membrane of their plasma membrane. But we're just going to focus on eukaryotic cells right now. This is a mitochondria. And there's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. Okay, and so I'm going to point that out. So this is the outer membrane. And the outer membrane is really, really smooth. And then we have an inner membrane here. And then I want to point out that on the inside is some liquid. And this liquid has a name, and it's called matrix. Okay, and so matrix is a liquid inside the mitochondria. And then you have this space in between the outer and inner membrane, which is called an inner membrane space. And then you have outside of the mitochondria, which is inside the cell. Okay, so we're going to go through all the steps, and these steps are happening in different parts of the mitochondria. And so step one is glycolysis, and glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. So we're going to say step one is glycolysis, and this occurs outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, and so I'm just going to draw it as this pink. And I'm just going to write it right here that this is glycolysis. Okay. And so glycolysis is occurring outside of the mitochondria. And the point of glycolysis is in the cell, in the cytoplasm, the cell is going to take that glucose and it's going to split it into two. Okay. So the point of glycolysis, I'm going to write this down. Okay, in glycolysis, glucose gets broken down into two pieces. Okay, and so if you remember, glucose is C6H12. So we have C6, oops, hang on. We have 6 carbons, we have 12 hydrogens, and we have 6 oxygens. Okay, so this is glucose here. And so I'm going to draw glucose like this, where we have these circles, or these little balls, are going to represent carbon atoms. And so we have 6 carbon atoms. Okay, and so let me connect those. And so this is our glucose molecule, for example. And then in glycolysis, what's going to happen is there's going to be a series of 10 steps. Okay, so I'm going to write that here. There's going to be 10 steps. Each step is facilitated by an enzyme. Okay, and at the end of the 10 steps, we're going to have 2 molecules with 3 carbons each. Okay, so I'm going to write that here. So we have 1, 2, 3. That's 1 molecule. And then we have another molecule here, which is 1, 2, 3. And each of these molecules is called pyruvate. So this is 1 pyruvate, and this is 2 pyruvates. And so I'm going to write here that we have 2 pyruvate molecules. Okay. And so each pyruvate molecule has 3 carbons in it. Okay. Plus we're going to have 2 ATP molecules. So in this process of glycolysis, we're going to generate 2 ATP molecules. Okay. Total, we generated 4 ATP molecules, but 2 of the ATPs were used in this process. Okay, so you kind of have to invest a little bit to get this whole thing going. But in the end of glycolysis, you end up with 2 ATP molecules. And then at the end, we also end up with this other type of molecule that holds energy called NADP. No, I'm sorry, NADH. Okay, and so NADH holds energy that can be used later. ATP holds energy that can be used later. So we're so far in glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, we have 2 pyruvate molecules plus 2 ATP molecules plus 2 NADH molecules. Okay, and that is the outcome of glycolysis. This happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Okay, then we move on to the next step, which is called the Krebs cycle. Step 2, the Krebs cycle. Oops. Okay, and the Krebs cycle has a different name sometimes, depending on what book you're using. Sometimes it's called the citric acid cycle. And that's because it makes citric acid in these reactions. But Krebs is based on the scientist who figured it out. And so he named it after himself. And so sometimes we call it the Krebs cycle also. So what happens is we are going to take these two pyruvate molecules. Okay, so these two ATP and two NADHs we're going to save for later. Okay, so right now we're working with the two pyruvate molecules, and those two pyruvate molecules are going to go into the citric acid cycle. And so I'm going to draw that here. So we have 1, 2, 3. Okay, and so each pyruvate molecule is going to go through one at a time. So I'm just going to draw the cycle for one, and then you could just double it because you can assume that the second one is also going to go through. And so what's going to happen is this pyruvate molecule is going to go into this cycle. And it is another series of 10 steps. One of them is going to make, one of the steps makes citric acid. But for each pyruvate molecule that goes in, I'm going to say there is 10 steps again, each facilitated by an enzyme. And what's going to come out of it is we are going to lose 3 carbon dioxides. Okay, so 3 CO2s. I'm going to actually write that like this. Okay, and so these 3 carbon molecules, these 3 carbon atoms in the pyruvate then gets transferred into 3 carbon dioxides. So see how there's only 1 carbon in carbon dioxide? Those carbons come from the pyruvate. And this is what you're going to exhale. So this is generated in your cells when you break down food, and then you exhale the carbon back into the atmosphere. Okay, and then it's going to be recycled over and over. So this is made during this Krebs cycle. Plus, we're going to get 2 ATP. Plus, we're going to get this new molecule called FADH2. FADH2. Okay, just one of those. And this is another molecule that stores energy, just like ATP, just like NADH. And we're going to get, let me think here. 2, so we're going to get 3 NADHs. Okay, and so that's what's going to happen in the citric acid cycle. And this happens inside the matrix of the mitochondria. Okay, so the Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria. Okay, so if we go back up here to the mitochondria, I'm going to put this in pink, and I'm going to draw the Krebs cycle as a circle, because what happens is the start point is the same as the end point, which is why we call it a cycle. So I'm drawing this as a circle that's going around and around in a circle. And this is happening. So glycolysis takes glucose, breaks it into 2 pyruvates. Then each pyruvate, one at a time, goes through the Krebs cycle. This happens in the matrix. And then it moves on to the third step, which is the electron transport chain, which is going to happen in the membrane of the mitochondria, the inner membrane. So see those little lines? Those are some proteins embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, so that's step 3. Step 3 is called the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain. Okay, and so I'm going to draw a picture here. And so in the electron transport chain, this is what is going to go in. Okay, so we lost all the carbons because the glucose got broken into pyruvate. Those got transformed into carbon dioxide, and now they're back in the air. So far in the 2 steps that we've gone through, we have generated these energy molecules. We have 2 ATPs plus 2 NADHs in step 1. And then we generate another 2 ATPs, so that makes 4 ATPs. So I'm going to write that here. So far we have 4 ATP plus we have 2 NADP from the glycolysis and 3 NADH from the Krebs cycle, but I want to point out that this is just for one pyruvate. So, okay, so I got to back up here. I'm sorry. So this is for one pyruvate. And so we have two pyruvate. So all these numbers are going to double. Okay. So we're going to end up with 6. So I'm going to write this here. Okay. We're going to have 2 pyruvate. Okay. That goes into the Krebs cycle. And then we're going to end up with 6 carbon dioxide. Okay. Plus 4 ATP plus 2 FADH plus 6 NADH. Okay, so that is the real formula for the Krebs cycle because we're dealing with 2 pyruvate, not 1. So here's the formula. Okay, so that comes out of the Krebs cycle. And then we're going into the electron transport chain, and that happens in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And so what we have now is we actually have 6 ATP because we have 4 from the Krebs cycle and 2 from glycolysis. Okay, so 6 ATP plus we have 6, 7, 8 NADH plus 2 FADH2. Okay. And then what's going to happen is we're going to make a lot of ATP. Okay, so lots of ATP is what's going to come out of the electron transport chain. Okay, and let me explain how that happens. So in the inner membrane of the of the mitochondria, let's see here. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to draw a picture of the mitochondria again, real quick. And we have our inner membrane. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a box of the inner membrane right here. This is like a square box. And I'm going to zoom into just that box. Okay. This is my zoom in box. Okay. And in the middle of that box is the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And as you know, membranes are made of a phospholipid bilayer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the phospholipid bilayer. And as you remember, a phospholipid bilayer is made up of 2 rows of phospholipids. Each phospholipid has a polar head, which is made of a glycerol, which is hydrophilic, loves the water, and that's why it's on the outside. And then there's another layer of glycerol heads of phospholipids. So there's another whole layer of phospholipids. And so what I'm doing right now is I'm drawing the heads of each phospholipid, okay? And there's going to be 2 layers of them. Okay, and as you remember, phospholipids have 2 fatty acid tails, okay? So I'm drawing them here, and I'm drawing them kind of quickly so that we can get this picture done. But if you remember, these legs are unsaturated, which means that they're kicking each other and they're making the whole substance be an oily substance at room temperature. And so this is kind of an oil layer. And it's oily because the fatty acid tails are unsaturated. Whoops. Oh no, the internet. Okay, so we have our phospholipid bilayer in our inner membrane of the mitochondria. And so this box here is representing this box here. And so on the top part of the box, that is the inner membrane space in between the outer membrane and the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So I'm going to write that here. I'm going to label it in blue So this is the inner membrane space between the outer and inner membrane. Okay. And then in here, underneath this phospholipid bilayer, we have the matrix. So I'm going to label that here. Okay. So that's what this box represents. So what I want to point out is that we have some integral proteins that go all the way through the membrane. Okay. And I'm going to draw that here. So I'm going to draw a couple of them. So here's one. I'm going to draw like 3 of them. Here's 2. Actually, let me redo that one. So these are integral proteins. Oh my goodness, sorry. That go all the way through the membrane. Okay, here's another one. Okay, here's a third one. Okay, and these integral proteins are called proton pumps. So I'm going to label that. Okay, so I'm going to put an arrow here, and I'm going to say these are called proton pumps. Another way of thinking about it is they're hydrogen ion pumps. Hydrogen ion pumps. Okay. And then all the way to the right, we're going to have another integral protein that is called ATP synthase. Okay. And this is an enzyme. And I'm going to draw it like this. This is like a very large enzyme. Let me color that in. Okay. So that is an enzyme. Okay. So what's going to happen here is that all these energy storing molecules. So right now we've got ATP, which is fine. We need ATP. That's the point of cellular respiration. So that's what we have here, ATP. And we have, but what's going to go into the electron transport chain are these, hold on, I don't want that. These 2 molecules are going to go into the mitochondria, into the inner membrane space between the outer and the inner membrane. And what's going to happen is these proton pumps are going to take these hydrogens off of the molecules. So what we're going to have is we're going to have NADH, and then that's going to turn into NAD plus an H. Okay, so an H, which is called a hydrogen ion, or sometimes we call it a proton. Okay, and the same thing is going to happen for FADH. So we have FADH2, and that's going to turn into FAD plus 2 hydrogens. Okay, because there's 2. You see how there's 2 right there? So these hydrogens right here are being taken off by these proton pumps, and they're going to they're going to be pumped through from the inner membrane space into the matrix. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So these hydrogens, let me use a different color here. I'm going to use black. So we have these H's are going to go through the pump into that space. Okay. And so what's going to happen there's going to be a bunch of hydrogens. Oh my goodness. Okay. So we have H's that are being taken off, the NADH and the FADH2. Okay. And they're going to be pumped through into the matrix. So these hydrogens go through these pumps into the matrix. So over time, what's going to happen is we're going to have a lot of hydrogen ions in the matrix. Okay, and so what the cell is doing is it's building up a high concentration of H's inside the matrix of the mitochondria. So it's doing this on purpose. Okay, and so the way that it gets energy to do this is it takes an electron from the NAD and the FAD, and it takes an electron off and it passes it from one hydrogen pump to the next hydrogen pump. And so that passing of electrons is what's providing some energy for this whole system to work. So over time, what's going to happen is we're going to have a very high concentration of hydrogen ions in the matrix of the mitochondria. And so what's going to happen is there's this enzyme downstream. This enzyme is called ATP synthase, and it's a very important enzyme, ATP synthase. And what its job is to make ATP. So the name of this enzyme is called ATP synthase. And its job is to make ATP. Okay? And the way that it does that is that these hydrogen ions are going to passively diffuse through ATP synthase, which generates enough energy for the ATP synthase to phosphorylate ADP into ATP. Okay, so let me just write that down. So these ATP molecules here are going to passively diffuse through ATP synthase, and it's going to give ATP synthase energy. So let me write that down. Hydrogen ions are going to passively diffuse through ATP synthase. Okay, and they passively diffuse through there because there are more hydrogen ions in the matrix compared to outside of the matrix. And things passively diffuse when there's a high concentration, it gets to a low concentration. So passively diffuse ATP synthase, this will give ATP synthase enough energy to do the chemical reaction to make ATP. Okay, and so what's going to end up happening is we're going to end up having ATP generated. Okay, lots of ATP. Okay, so this ATP synthase is going to generate a lot of ATP. And in the end, because we have all these energy storing molecules, NADH and FADH2, those hydrogen ions are going to passively diffuse through ATP synthase, generating a lot of ATP. And that's what we're going to get out of the whole cellular respiration. So just to review, we started out with glucose, which was C6. Whoops. Let me get rid of my arrows. So just to review, we started out with C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus we needed oxygen, okay? And then we're going to generate lots of ATP. So I'm just going to put lots of ATP. Okay. Some books get hung up on the number. It's between 34 and 38. But I don't expect you to memorize a number for this. There's going to be a lot of it. So lots of ATP, plus we're making CO2, which happens in the Krebs cycle. Plus we're making, actually, I'm going to write this because we're going to make 6 CO2, plus we're going to generate some water. Okay, and so I just want to point out a couple of things. The oxygen comes in when you inhale, and the 2 steps that need oxygen. I'm going to write that right here. The oxygen is needed for the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So Krebs cycle and electron transport chain need oxygen. Glycolysis does not need oxygen. And then the water is generated in the electron transport chain. Okay, so this is generated in the electron transport chain. Okay, and that's it for cellular respiration. Okay, I will see you guys next time.